Hello everybody, Ken Stout here. We'd like to welcome you to another edition of ReadyLift TV. Today we're going to introduce you to the installation of our very popular 4-inch SST tubular control arm lift kit for the 2007 and up Toyota Tundra pickup truck. We begin the installation by first removing the battery. This is a requirement in order to access the upper control arm bolt on the driver's side. Next, we want to lift the vehicle and remove the stock wheels and tires. In order to access the suspension and differential, the factory skid plate must be removed. The inner fender well debris skirt must also be removed or moved out of the way enough to be able to get to the suspension. Unbolt and disconnect the wheel speed sensor cable from the control arm. This step is very important. The first part of the suspension disassembly process is the tie rods. They must be unbolted and removed from the upright to avoid overstressing the inner tie rod seal. Remove the nut and tap the upright with a hammer to loosen. Then remove the tie rod. With the tie rods unbolted, next we move over to the sway bar and unbolt it from the frame. The first step in removing the upper control arm is to unbolt the upper ball joint from the upright. Leave the nut loosely attached and tap with a hammer to break it loose. Now we can begin the exercise of removing the upper control arm bolt, which is a long bolt that extends all the way through both control arm ears. The bolt will have to be removed forward and into the area where the battery was removed from. Next, we want to loosen the 4 upper strut nuts, but do not completely remove them yet. With a support stand placed under the lower control arm, we can remove the lower strut bolt that extends through the control arm. A good alignment tip is to mark the lower control arm adjuster cams before loosening up the lower control arm bolts. With the lower control arm hardware loosened and the upper strut nuts removed, the factory strut can be removed from the vehicle. As with all ReadyLift SST lift kits for Tundra trucks, we supply differential drop spacers to lower the differential. With the differential supported, remove the factory differential mounting bolts. One of the great features of this kit is that we've taken the time to make sure the suspension retains the factory ride and suspension performance. To make sure you cannot overcompress the strut, we provide front bump stop spacers which easily install into the factory bump stop and into the frame. Now it's time to begin installation of the strut extension. After applying thread locker to the factory studs, install the ReadyLift 4-inch strut extension onto the strut. Before installing the struts back into the truck, the provided sway bar spacers are installed to hold the sway bar in place while the sway bar end links are unbolted to allow the lower control arm to droop. With the lower control arm supported, the brake line bracket is removed from the upright and from the frame to give the line some slack during the strut installation process. Depending on the model Tundra, the lower strut stem may be larger than normal. A small area inside of the lower strut mount pocket in the lower control arm will need to be trimmed to give the strut stem clearance at full droop. This will make installing the strut assembly easier. This only applies to trucks with the thicker lower strut stem. If this clearance is required, it will be noticeable when installing the strut back into the suspension. With the strut installed, reinstall the factory lower bolt along with the new provided nuts for the upper strut extension bolts. Before installing the ReadyLift tubular upper control arms, the provided bushings must be installed into the arms, followed by applying a liberal amount of the special bushing grease provided with the kit. It is very important to remember to grease the sleeves when installing the bushings, otherwise bushing damage may occur over time. Now we can install the new upper control arm. Having a second pair of hands certainly helps to guide the long stock upper control arm bolt through the engine compartment and into the control arm. Use the factory washers and nuts to secure the arm, then guide the ball joint into the upright knuckle. When installed, tighten both the upper control arm hardware along with the ball joint. Once the suspension has been securely tightened back up, reinstall the brake line knuckle and frame brackets along with the wheel speed sensor cable and connection. Next, we want to install the provided differential drop spacers and secure both outer and inner differential mounts. Rotate the alignment cams to the marked position, then tighten up the control arms. The last step to button up the front suspension is to install the tie rod into the knuckle and torque down. Don't forget to install those cotter pins. Finally, we want to reinstall the skid plate. We provided half-inch spacers to allow the skid plate to clear the lower differential. Moving to the rear of the truck, first remove the rear tire and wheel. Then unbolt the wheel speed sensor bracket from the axle housing, followed by removing the bolt holding the parking brake cable bracket. Doing so allows the rear end housing to be lowered without damaging the lines and cable. Next, we want to remove the rear shocks by unbolting them both top and bottom. With the axle properly supported, unbolt and remove the factory U-bolts and axle plate. Now carefully lower the rear axle housing just enough to install the ReadyLift 2-inch rear block with the block locator pin facing downward. Then raise the axle upwards and install the new U-bolts. Add a dash of anti-seize to the U-bolt threads, then install the nuts and tighten. Be sure to torque the nuts before hitting the road. Since we have lowered the rear end housing down with the addition of the rear blocks, we provide a brake line bracket extension to prevent line stretching. Speaking of extensions, we have one for your factory rear shocks too. To install it, begin by removing the upper bushings followed by applying thread locker to the factory stem. Then install the ReadyLift threaded extension onto the factory stem and tighten it down. With the stem installed, the rear shocks are reinstalled onto the truck using the factory hardware. To button up the rear suspension, reinstall the parking brake cable bracket and wheel speed sensor cable bracket on the rear end. You'll also need to bend the factory speed sensor line bracket on the bottom side of the bed downward to provide additional slack in the lines. We're just about done now. Here we install a fresh set of Nitto tires and method wheels. Then with the truck on the ground, reattach the sway bar end links, reinstall the battery, and finally make a pass over all the hardware on the suspension to check everything has been properly tightened. With some 35-inch tall tires and 5.5 or 6-inch back spacing wheels, the tires will touch the skid plate at full turn. To remedy this, scribe a line as shown here, then trim the edge off the skid plate to give the tire the clearance it needs at full turn. And that about wraps it up, folks. Thanks for watching this installation on our popular 69-5475 4-inch SST Lift Kit for the 2007 and up Toyota Tundra truck.